my family's history of being located at what is now Hampton University. And so Hampton also was started when the Civil War ends by the Freedmen's Bureau, which is an initiative from the federal government to try to solve a dilemma. The dilemma is that you have 4 million formerly enslaved people who are illiterate because young folks sometimes don't learn in middle school that it's illegal to read and write if you are enslaved. And so this is a project for citizenship, but what we also learned from Booker T. Washington, and that's Hampton's most famous alum, is that it's also a project in some ways of civilization. And what I mean by that is if you read Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery, he says that he was born enslaved, and the master was his biological father. Slavery ends when he's 11, and he walks from West Virginia to attend Hampton. Not to get higher book learning originally, the first thing they teach him is how to brush his teeth. He's never done such because he was enslaved. The next thing they do is teach him how to make a bed because he's never slept in one. And so Mr. Booker T. Washington, once he gets the highest level of knowledge that you can get at a place like Hampton at the time, is so inspired by this, he ends up becoming the founder of Tuskegee University in Alabama. And so this, opens up for opportunities where Black women were able to get enough education to pass a civil service exam. Also, people ask me about sexism, and at this point in time, you don't have a lot of gender discrimination because Booker T. Washington was encouraging men to learn as much about labor as they possibly could, thinking that those who'd be the best bricklayers would be economically competitive for jobs. And so that meant that there were opportunities for women to learn any kind of book learning that there was, because we're at a moment where people feel that the race needs to be uplifted. So now we have to go back again and look at NACA. How does NACA become NASA? So as we move into the 1950s, there are people in the room who are probably old enough to know that the Soviet Union ends up outer space before we do, and they launch Sputnik. Now, for those of you all who've seen the movie, you might remember that Kevin Costner's character is extremely frustrated, and he says, how did we end up second in a two-dog race, right? And so he's really mad. And as we know, as Americans, we can be a very competitive culture, and so it's at this moment that the National Defense Education Act is passed, which is an initiative to put lots of funding into this project and to get us from NACA to NASA, and we officially enter the space race. Also, if you know anything about what sort of feels like modern American history to me, not modern for young people, is that this would be the time around a presidential election. And this is when Kennedy decides, when he's running for president, that being competitive in the space race was going to be at the top of his political agenda. So that's how things shift. So I want to briefly tell you a story about one of the women I highlight in my book. This is Annie Easley, who was born in 1933 in Birmingham, Alabama. She ends up moving to Cleveland, Ohio in 1955, sees an ad in the paper to work at the Cleveland NASA, or NACA at the time, and gets the job to be a human computer. There are only about 4 or 5 Black women that work there at all, and so they decide to allow them to work on integrated teams. So as she's doing her work, someone comes in, because sometimes when you're doing your job, people take pictures of you, and they photograph her doing her work, and when the photograph comes back to be put in the company newsletter, they see that she's there, and they decide to crop her out. And so Annie, of course, is devastated, and they say to her, like, Annie, you have to be realistic. It's the 1950s, this is where we are in America, it will disrupt the sensibilities of people, and you can't be in the photo. Now, this story actually has a happy ending, because if you fast forward about a decade, here is a picture of Annie Easley, who's actually on the cover of the Science and Engineering newsletter. And the reason why she's undercover is because she's taken the initiative to take evening classes at Cleveland State to learn Fortran. So Fortran, of course, is the language that you needed to learn to program the computers. And so one of the reasons why I picked the image of my book where you have, just show you really briefly here, the image of, this is Melba Roy Moten, who actually isn't my grandmother. She worked at the Goddard NASA in Maryland, next to the newfangled technology of the time, the IBM, which, as we know, was big enough to take up space of an entire wall. We wanted to pick this image because it shows the tension between the human computer and then the machine computer, because what the women knew is that if they didn't learn how to program this, they would become obsolete. And so that's what Annie does. She learns programming. Now, once again, because this is racial politics in America, it's complicated. She's allowed to become an engineer, but NASA doesn't pay her tuition to go to Cleveland State at night, even though they're paying the tuition of the other NASA employees. And so all of these things are happening at the same time. What Annie's doing is very similar to what Dorothy Vaughan is doing in the movie. One of the things that I loved about the movie is that it did maintain some historical accuracy in the sense that a lot of people think that when Brown versus Board of Education happened in '54, segregation was just dismantled, like overnight. Right? And what they show in the movie is that even though it's the early '60s, the library is still segregated. So she goes into the library, and the librarian is like very upset, doesn't want any problems, but she can't find a Fortran book in the colored section of the library. So she goes over and finds the Fortran book. What we don't know until she gets on the back of the segregated bus is that she has liberated the book from the library. Now, I don't recommend that. I don't think Miss Steve would like that if you all did that here in San Diego. And times have changed, so it's not necessary, right? And so she's sitting back there with her two sons, and we've already had the church scene in the movie, so we know she's a good, God-fearing woman. And so her little boy looks at her and says, "Mama, you stole the book?" And she said, "I pay my tax dollars," right? And so, but what she's doing is like she needs to learn that so she can program that IBM. And so what right there you're seeing is like this subversive narrative of having to steal the knowledge. Annie easily doesn't have to steal it, she just has to pay for it. Okay? So, a little bit more about Annie Easley. I know there's a lot of words on the slides, mostly so I don't forget to tell you things. Is that she isn't just a mathematician, as if that wasn't enough. She also is a civil rights activist. And so sometimes people don't realize that even into the late 50s and early 60s, people were being charged poll taxes. And so Annie Easley actually had to pay a poll tax, and what they told her was, we will only charge you $2 because you have a 4-year degree. And so she was really active in voter registration, and she also ends up becoming the first equal employment opportunity counselor for NASA. And so what I learned about Annie Easley, she sounded familiar to me in the sense that in my mind I could negotiate that you could both be a mathematician and involved in civil rights. And one of the reasons why that didn't seem like a conflict of interest to me is because my grandmother was actually the one that removed the colored signs at the NASA Langley, even though the movie tells you differently. I know this on good authority. I mean, it's the best story ever. So NASA interviews my mom in 2011, and they have it documented on their website. It's also in Smithsonian Magazine. And my uncle, who's 84, who is sharp as a tack, loves telling the story about how their parents used to fight all the time, and how amused he was by that when he was a little boy. And they used to fight because my grandfather didn't like her stealing the sign. He was afraid she'd get caught, she would get fired, and then she would lose that $1,400 a year. Now that I'm a college professor, in hindsight, I look back on it, I think to myself, she probably made more than he did. No wonder he didn't want her to lose that job. So, the notion of, being involved in civil rights as you were doing the work at NASA all of those things can happen at the same time. Now, how did they exist at NASA during this time of civil rights? Originally, my grandmother, the first 10 years she was there, she had to eat at her desk. She wasn't allowed to leave her building. As you get into the 1950s, this is a diagram that I found from the archives. What is circled in the purple, or I should say what is just outlined, because that's not a circle, oops. What is outlined in the purple is the colored dining area. What is next to it is the kitchen, and what is next to the kitchen is the white dining. And so if you had a copy of my book, you'd see that those are doors also next to the colored dining. What they were supposed to do is walk over from the west area. This building is located in the east area, eat in the colored dining section, and go back. And so that was like that for about 10 years. My grandmother retired from NASA in 1966. Before she left, it was completely desegregated. Now, to give NASA credit, they decided they were going to have to get with the times in terms of working with people who did civil rights, partly because 8 out of the 10 NASAs were in the South. And so one of the initiatives that they had was to hire the actress Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek, to be a national spokesperson for NASA. Now, I have to tell you, I've talked about my book a lot this year. I was fortunate enough to go to the Johnson C. Space Center in Houston, and I spoke to their employees. They did not know this. Like, they did not know that Nichelle Nichols had, been at the forefront of recruiting people to work at NASA. So I was delighted that I could share that with them because they were all techie people and I wasn't able to answer any of those questions. So I was like, well, I do pop culture. Here's an actress. So when I'm talking to really young people, I have to explain to them one of the things that made Nichelle Nichols so significant is that this is the mid-1960s. And at this time, we only have 3 television channels. Now, I have 3 kids, and I say that, and they say it isn't so, right? I mean, it's like very disturbing to them. And not only did we not only have 3 television channels, there were only 2 black women on TV. So the other black woman was Diane Carroll, who played on the show called Julia. Julia was a nurse. She worked for this very kind doctor. She was a single mom. It was acceptable because she was a widow. She had a cute little boy. And, it was a lovely show. It had a following. It had no following like Star Trek. And I mean, at the time, nothing had a following like Star Trek. What that meant was that Nichelle Nichols was the most visible face in pop culture that is in a black woman's body. And so everyone recognized her. And so it was a perfect opportunity for NASA to, take her to go all throughout the nation to see if they could diversify their employee pool. Okay. And so all of this, kind of leads us to a point where Mae Jemison becoming the first black woman astronaut really has the backdrop of black women having been at NASA for 4 decades already. And most people would not have known that when Mae Jemison became an astronaut. And so in some ways, she is standing on their shoulders. And so I'm just about ready to wrap up. This is an image that's in my book, and I'm pretty biased, I have to admit. It is my favorite image. The couple on the sofa are my deceased grandparents. On each end, the young men, those are my uncles, and the teenager on the pillow is my mom, who is now 82 years young. And so that is a family photo of them during this time period. And so I really enjoy this photo, clearly partly because it's sentimental, but also, the sepia tone, all of that. My youngest was 10 when the book came out, and I tried to get him, jazzed up about the photo. He could have absolutely cared less. And so, I didn't even want, the author ego stroke. I wanted a mom win. And the only thing I could do to, bring him into this project at all was when I explained to him that there were going to be human-computer Legos. And then he goes to school and tells his teacher that his great-grandma was going to be a Lego. So that's as far as I got with him. But I mean, it's something. If you have kids, you gotta like take what you can get. So I'm gonna wrap up by saying that my family story hopefully is a story for everyone. And I've had such a good time being here this afternoon. I would love to take questions, and thank you for having me. And so just to give you an idea of me trying to do this as a research project, and it's partly why it couldn't be my tenure project, is because I knew I couldn't gather the materials when I was trying to gather them in enough time. I was on the phone with a research organization trying to get some grant money. And I said, this is the story, this is what I'm trying to do. And they said, Nassau, Bahamas? And I said, no, NASA. And they were like, NASA? And then, like, I'm not trying to stereotype, but I could tell the woman was African American. She's like, black people and NASA? And I said, black people and NASA. And she was like, well, I'll see if I can find some money for you. But I mean, it is so unbelievable also, and it's partly unbelievable because it's 11 years before Brown versus Board. And so even getting the money, and the reason for people who don't do research why we need the money, I brought a research assistant with me. We both needed plane tickets, a place to stay, going back and forth, and then making sure we could get copies. All of that takes a certain amount of money. And no one wants to fund a project that they don't think will have some kind of end product. But you have to convince them that it is real, right? And if there hadn't been a Hollywood movie, now granted I had my digital archive set up well before there was even a thought of a movie, and I had my manuscript done well before a movie deal was signed. But I mean, if I hadn't had some internal college support, and I've been on my faculty for 23 years, I don't know how this would have happened because it just wasn't real to people. Hmm?
I feel wrong.
I think there's so many, I think this is nothing, like this is one book, right? I think there's so many stories out there that we don't know because people have to tell them. And also, it's intergenerational. I feel like when older people are telling these stories, we have to listen. And I used to blow my mom off. I was like, nobody cares. I think it's like either nobody cares or because like this is ridiculous. But the area of Virginia that we're from, like in all honesty, a lot of people work there. So when I was inappropriately sassy, I was like, everybody had it all to do with NASA. Right? And I'm so glad my mom's still with me, so she can say, I tell you. And I have teenagers of my own who are completely unimpressed by all of this. I'm like, okay, at some point they'll say, okay, my mom left behind the story. Right now they're just mad that I'm out of town and they're in 6 inches of snow. So, yeah.
Are you currently entertaining perhaps a book?
Mm-hmm.
Can you remember this story because it's an amazing story and one that certainly needs to be told over and over again. So are you currently working on that?
Actually, I have a collection of books that were released in December. They aren't directly connected to this story, but I have an exclusive contract with my publisher, which is called ABDO. And what we're doing is a collection of books for 3rd to 6th graders and then 6th to 12th graders. And they're all basically these unknown, untold stories. And so that's my new thing. And it's very new for me. Like I spent the first 20 years of my career doing, highly footnoted, what some people might say, esoteric, peer-reviewed journal articles that 8 people read. So if nothing else, like people read this stuff, so I like that.
I'll talk loud.
Okay.
My question is, as I hear your story, I have a question because I have 5 kids.
Okay.
And I know the tremendous pressure that I place on them to get their education, etc. So did you, coming from the background that you come from, did your parents or grandparents, really push you to get to where you're at, or was that just a drive that you had on your own?
The way that it worked for me, and I feel so fortunate about this, is that it was around my sophomore or junior year of college that I realized that I wanted to be a professor. what it did for me was my grandfather passed away before I was born, but I knew he was a professor. Like, they're buried on Hampton's campus. And so it made me realize that it could happen, right? So I didn't feel like I had like this overbearing family that was like, you better do something, because we all did. Like, I didn't feel that. What I felt instead was, this is going to be a lot of work, but people have done it before me. And, you know, people ask me that, like, about my own kids. Like, do they feel pressured? And I'm like, if they do, they're not showing it. So, you're not scared of me? Yeah.
What did you originally go to college for?
Sure. So, okay, this is hilarious. So, for the first 6 weeks, I was going to be an orthodontist. That was not a good fit. I think, no, seriously, I think I realized, like, around Halloween that, like, that was not a good path. And so I ended up majoring in history and minoring in English, knowing that I was going to do that kind of work. And it would have something to do with, like, evoking African American stories, but I wasn't sure. And then I went to grad school in American Studies, and then I worked it out. Yeah. I'm glad I'm not an orthodontist. I don't have the disposition for that. So. Yeah.
What made you decide to go into your law studies?
You know, that was the first post-tenure project. And what it was is that I'd done a postdoc at the University of Minnesota's Institute on Race and Poverty, which was a research center at their law school. And I'd been offered a second year of that or a visit at the college where I eventually got a job. So I left that institute, but I was really intrigued. And so after I got tenure, I took evening classes at a local law school. So now I teach legal studies as well. I taught at a law school one summer, and you know, adults were just a little more jaded than I was ready to. You know, 18 to 22-year-olds haven't given up yet. I'm sorry.
Did your grandmother communicate her story?
Well, okay, the way that it worked for me is that my legal name is Miriam. I was named after her because I was the only grandchild that was born after she passed away. And so she passed away in 67. I was born in 69, which is also the year we get to the moon. So of course my parents were like, oh, we're gonna have to name her Miriam. And so my mom, however, is like the family oral historian. And so I knew her and I knew the story. I can't think of one moment in my life when I didn't know the story. It just wasn't until I became an adult that I was able to appreciate the story. Yeah.
So where does the name Duchess come from?
You know, it's funny. So, I mean, I come from, I don't know how familiar you are with the South, but in the South, people just call their kids like anything, right? So, like anything. And so this is embarrassing. It's like, he's over here asking, like, did they really pressure you? So my family, I didn't even know my name was Miriam until I was being signed up for kindergarten. So like that was the level of, they were just gonna call me something, so they called me Duchess, and then we show up for kindergarten registration, and I was like, who's that? And so I can have a pretty defiant personality, and people say I do get that from my grandmother, and so I told them on that day I wasn't gonna answer to it. And they were like, of course you will, and I was like, no I'm not. Okay, so like fast forward how many decades? So yeah, I only have Miriam on legal documents. I cash paychecks with Duchess on it, so they know me at the bank. Anything else? Don't be shy. Oh, right there. You don't know, I mean, I'm kind of branching off on some different things. And so one of my recent books that came out in December is called Sexism in Politics. And we actually went to print before, like, you know, everything with Me Too that's been going on. But one of the things that we do is this, you know, big historical overview of what it has taken for women to try to break glass ceilings in electoral politics. And it's not grassroots organizing, I'm interested in that as well, but this book in particular is just electoral politics. And it's not partisan, it's both the Democrat and Republican Party. No third party stuff, so, sorry. Okay.
I'll talk. Okay. So did your book come out before the movie?
Definitely. So let me give you a little background on that. When I finally did get some grant money from people that knew that it wasn't Nassau, Bahamas, I won a Humanities Foundation grant from the state of Virginia. I won that grant with Margot Lee Shetterly, who wrote the Hidden Figures book, which is a different book. And so we did research together. Margot was trained as a journalist, and what I learned is that she wanted to write a book for adults, with just like a mainstream appeal. And I knew I wanted to do something for young people. What Margot did was shop her story to Hollywood. And Ted Melfi was her 19th try. And then he said yes. When she handed it over to Ted Melfi, she lost the rights to the story. So to be fair to Margot, if you read her book, she mentions my grandmother like about 20 times. And she tells the colored sign story very differently in her book. So that's just how all that came about. Yeah, and so, but my book was done before they signed the contract. They signed the contract around this time, like February, March of like say 2015 or early 2016. And so I contacted the publisher that I'd already been working with and said, let's get this out before Christmas. I knew it was going to come out in a few states at Christmas, and then like the first week of 2017. So my book came out December of 2016. Partly, I knew my college also, because they put so much funding into it, I didn't want it to seem like I was chasing the movie, because I wasn't.
Anybody else? All right.
I got her autograph and she said that I look pretty and that like my dad was talking about how he went to the Hampton University too, and she's saying that I would be successful in life, and she gave me her autograph.
Wow. And so why did you want to meet her? What was it about her that wanted?
Because I liked her grandmother's story, and I wanted to, I liked the whole speech about it, and that we got to learn new things, because I saw the movie, but I didn't know a lot of things about like the movie that she said.
A lot of hard work, huh? Show me your book. Hold it real up, like right up here. Listen. And the autograph, let me see. A little higher. There we go. Nice. So how did you like meeting her?
I liked meeting her. She was very nice, and up close she was like actually like really funny and stuff. And also in her presentation, like there's a lot of stuff that I didn't get, but there's like most of the stuff was really really happy, and there's a lot more work than like they said in the movie. Like I didn't know that her grandmother put down the signs. I thought it was the other lady, because in the movie it doesn't show her. It shows, I think, Catherine or something.